All right, welcome everybody to the Canadian Philosophy Show. Hope you're all doing well. My name's Tagen Marshall, and I'm here with three esteemed co-hosts and technical support. Why don't we start with Nicole? Nicole, why don't you tell us something you've learned in philosophy recently that you found interesting?
Oh, that's a cool question. I am taking an aesthetics class this semester, and I did not have any sort of background in aesthetics and philosophy of art. And I learned about different conceptions of beauty, different conceptions of art. One thing I learned about specifically is formalism, as opposed to kind of like representational art. And formalism is a type of art that focuses on the structure and form of things instead of maybe like the meaning behind it, or trying to capture something exactly the way it is in real life. Formalism allows things like abstract art to be considered real art. So it's interesting for me to think about all the different types of views on what makes art, and that's interesting to me. Thank you for asking.
Thanks, Nicole. Mark, what about you?
Well, I suppose I'm taking a Kant course. Perhaps the better way of saying it is I'm suffering through a Kant course. But I found he has like a distinction between like real and logical necessity, which I found really interesting. That there's this argument for that. There's necessary things that you can't really put into any like logical argument for, and so on. And I thought that was quite beautiful in a way. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And Michael Robert Caditz, what about you? Oh, we can't hear
Are you assuming that I learned something in philosophy?
You must unlearn what you have learned.
Well, I learned that there are way more questions than answers. And so what I learned wasn't what I thought I was going to learn. So what I thought I was going to learn was the answers to the most profound questions of the universe. And what I actually learned was that that there really aren't any answers, because no matter what answer you come up with, the professor will say you're wrong.
It's true.
We say that, but I think the journey is the best part of our discipline. Learning to discover and work through that, I think, is the best part. So, now that we've introduced everybody, I introduced myself already. I'm Tagen Marshall. I'll be your kind of lead host for today. But thankfully, I have my esteemed co-host to assist me through this journey. So, tonight, we are revisiting Grover's Corners. So I hope that you will journey with us as we continue our look into Our Town by Thornton Wilder. Before we get started, I want to briefly give a 5-minute, maybe not even 5-minute, but just give a quick summary of Our Town for those of you who have not read it before or heard our last show, just so you kind of know what you're stepping into, so you're not like, what is this? Our Town by Thornton Wilder was first produced in 1938. As stated, it's a play by Thornton Wilder, go figure. But the play centers around really some major themes: life, love, and loss, and what that means for us as human beings. In the play, we enter into Grover's Corners. We are introduced to our main characters, that of Emily Webb, George Gibbs, and some of the other townspeople, along with one of the most interesting characters of the entire production, the stage manager. So we'll start by just briefly discussing each character so you know their significance in this this production. Emily Webb is going to be the character we probably focus the most on, because it is with Emily that some of the biggest moments of the production happen. Grover's Corners is introduced to us by the stage manager as being a town which is very conforming, a town that is very structured and does not necessarily grasp at life or question the normal social standards. In fact, when we are introduced to Mrs. Webb's and Mrs. Gibbs' garden, we're told but there's but one difference: sunflowers in one and not in the other. So right from that get-go, we see very different, not very different, can't talk today apparently, very similar ways that they live their lives, and this will continue. But then we get to Emily. Emily is a girl who's probably in her teen years, but she is very, very passionate. She is very full of zeal and hopes and dreams and desires. She's motivated. And so you can imagine, for a town which is very regimented, very structured, very this is the way things go, to have a girl like Emily who has dreams, who has aspirations, who is very subconsciously, I think, questioning what Grover's Corners is all about. This can be frightening, and I'll get into that in a few minutes when we really do a deep dive into the play. George Gibbs, really quick, is Emily's love interest. He's also her next door neighbor, and George Gibbs is very simplistic. He does not have those motivations. He does not have those desires. All he wants to do is be a farmer. A noble desire, to be sure, but not necessarily one that really matches with Emily's ambitions and dreams and desires. He's not really that much of a go-getter. He's still trying to conform to society. The stage manager is a character that is fascinating and continues to demand further research and further study, I think. The stage manager is our narrator. It is the stage manager who really walks us through some of the key points of the play. In fact, it's the stage manager himself that keeps the play moving from moment to moment. Our town is divided into 3 acts. The first act, we are introduced to Grover's Corners and the people of Grover's Corners, and start to see Emily's character develop. The second act, we focus in on a relationship of George and Emily and how their love grows. And then finally in the third act, we deal with probably the biggest question, and it's not necessarily the explicit question, but it is a very philosophical question. What comes after death? Does anything come after death? And for Emily, she gets to see the world after she has exited it with this new understanding, this new awareness that she didn't have before. And so really, this question of living with intention, because Emily will become aware of how lacking her relationships had been, how lacking her life had been in terms of being able to pursue her dreams and her hopes and her aspirations. and how she kind of settled. But we'll get more into that as the time goes on. So yeah, there are a few themes I want to touch on. I want to touch on the relational aspect of our town, what that looks like. The relating in terms of Emily and George's romantic relationship, and then finally, how do we live with intentionality? How do we live with purpose and passion and zeal? Even when we do need to conform to some social standards. This is a very important question, especially being in the midst of the pandemic, which we are. Even though we can't do as much, how do we still pursue our passions, pursue our interests, even in a more limited capacity? And as well, I will be taking questions and answering questions from my co-hosts. And I will be monitoring our YouTube feed tonight. So if you want to do that, you can comment. We also have a Facebook page. It's just the Canadian Philosophy Show on Facebook. Feel free to leave comments and questions on there, and we will respond to you as soon as we can with an answer. All right, well, you think that was enough of a synopsis for everyone? Good stuff.
Good for me.
So, folks, where do you want to begin? Just tell me where and we'll get going.
I guess one question that I have that I'm still questioning a little bit about is, what evidence do we have regarding the intention of the author Thornton Wilder? Like, what did he intend to portray with the play? Did he intend to portray these existential themes of life, death, purpose, authenticity, which we are examining today? And is that the primary focus of what he's trying to get across, or is there some other type of intention there? So Tagen, I would like, as you as the expert here, I would like to put that question on you. What do you think that Thornton Wilder intended to portray here?
Expert is such a big word that I would not necessarily ascribe to myself. But looking at the context and the time period of when Our Town was originally produced and performed in 1938, there certainly is questions. There certainly seems to be this acknowledgement that as a society, we take things for granted. And I think when 1939 rolled around, I can't help but wonder if some of the people that had seen the production started to wonder if that was what he was getting at. That we took our relationships, we took our lives, we took the way we lived our lives and pursued our passions and our desires for granted, or that we weren't aware of how we might pursue our fullest potential. As my co-host and I had discussed the other night while viewing the play itself, Michael, do you want to share the observation you made? Because I think it's an important observation that you brought to the table when looking at this.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the context of the question that you asked, what was Wilder, or maybe you asked that, Nicole, what was Wilder trying to convey? I want to start minimalistically, which is to state what is pretty clear before we even get to themes of existentialism and meaning and life and is what happens after death. Before we even get to those things, I think it's clear that Wilder was trying to critique and criticize the way that the people, at least in that sample town, Grover's Corners, live their lives, because that's clear, because in the third part, when Emily dies and she joins all the other people that have died in this hypothetical, fictitious world, right, wherever that is in the afterlife, and they're conversing with each other, Emily expresses a desire to go back to visit Grover's Corners, to go back into life temporarily, and she's advised not to. She's advised by the others, including, I believe, the stage manager, not to. Why would you want to do that? And she insisted, and so she went, and then she had an experience there, back in life for a short time, and she was so disillusioned that she said, I want to die again. And she pretty quickly returned back, came back to the world of the dead, which she preferred. To me, that is a clear statement by the author that death was actually better, preferable to life in that town, the way that those people lived. That's the general statement. There's also a specific incident, which I'll get to later, which I think is the focal point, the main point of the whole play. That a specific incident that happened when Emily went back to be alive for a short time. Mm-hmm. But I'll get to that later.
Yeah. So one thing that struck me about that scene that Mikey just laid out for us is Emily says to Mother Gibbs, George's mother, how long does this feeling last? I don't like feeling new here. That feeling of being somewhere where she hadn't been before, being outside of her comfort zone, caused her anxiety because it was never what she was used to. And I think that's a powerful statement. So at this point, I'll open it up for further questions, and we'll just see where we get in this. All right. Well, seeing as there's no immediate questions that jump to mind, let me jump in and start to discuss the kind of some of the moments in the play where we see Emily reaching for something, but very quickly being brushed aside as if that was not to be tolerated, or that was not to be strived for. We see Mrs. Webb with her two children at the breakfast table. I talked about this in our last show on Our Town, but I'll talk about it again because as I watched it again, it still startled me. Mrs. Webb says the following: I would rather have my children healthy than bright. Emily, being a girl full of ambitions, full of hopes and desires, says, I'm both, Mama. I'm the smartest girl at school for my age. I'm both. And Mrs. Webb says, oh, hush up now. Eat your breakfast. So that self-awareness that Emily carries is very swiftly shot down because we don't talk about ourselves that way. We don't bolster ourselves that way. That's just not acceptable. And we see across the street at the Gibbs's house, Rebecca, George's younger sister, yelled down the stairs when when she says to her mother, "I have nothing to wear to school," Mrs. Gibbs says, "I ironed I think it was the blue dress for you," or whatever. And she says, "But Ma, I look like a sick turkey." And she comes down the stairs and stuff. But she asks, I think her and Emily both ask a similar question. I hope I'm not getting this wrong. That would be embarrassing. But I'm pretty sure it's Emily that just asked the question. But Mrs. Gibbs says to Rebecca, "You look fine. You look good enough. Don't worry about it. Just you look fine." But there's no real consolation in that statement. It's more, whatever, get on with yourself, move on with life. Emily asked this question at one point in the play, and she says, "Mama, do you think I'm pretty?" And she says, "Oh, pretty enough for all intents and purposes." Because that's what you're supposed to say. So that you don't make anyone feel inferior. You don't go against the status quo. You don't raise yourself up above anybody else. And I think that's an interesting social standard, because I'm sure we can point to certain situations within our own society where that kind of leveling occurs when it's not necessarily justified.
My interpretation, I guess, like, my interpretation is pretty similar, like, to that statement by her mother. You're pretty enough for all intents and purposes. I interpreted that as kind of a reflection of Growers Corners and how ambition is not necessarily something that is encouraged if it is going beyond the status quo. And I interpreted that statement as being like, almost as, don't use your good looks as a bargaining chip for your ambition. So like, don't try to like get something more than like what is average for Growers Corners. Like, just settle down with like a farmer's boy. Just just live a normal life. Yes, and what she does, which is funny. But that's how I kind of interpreted it, as like almost a commentary on how having that sort of ambition is not encouraged in Growers Corners. And it's an interesting way to think about it through the lens of attractiveness as well.
Yeah. I have a different interpretation.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a different. I hear that, Nicole, and I have another interpretation, which is that it's punctuates what I see as one of the main themes of the play, which is that in Grover's Corners, the people don't really relate to each other in a deep way or on an emotional level. They relate superficially. And when Emily asks her mother, "Am I pretty?" I hear that as a common self-identity exploration that teenagers do. They wonder, what their identity in the world is. Are they pretty? Are they ugly? Are they smart? Are they not smart? And what's behind it are questions and emotional issues and a need to develop a self-identity. And the mother's response is to try and get rid of the question as quickly as possible. So rather than the mother saying, "Oh dear, I hear that you're having questions about yourself, and how do you feel about yourself, and why do you ask?" Rather than explore the issue and relate to her daughter, the mother wants to pass off and get rid of the question as quickly as possible. And so her answer is, "Oh, you're pretty enough. Let's move on to the next thing." So that's how I interpret that, as an example that the author puts in there of how the mother is unable or unwilling to relate on a deeper emotional level to a growing teenage daughter.
Now, I think there's something profound in what you just said, because one thing we realize is that both, correct me if I'm wrong, folks, because I don't want to be completely off base, but I seem to recall we find out that both Mrs. Gibbs and Mrs. Webb were in arranged marriages. They were not self-chosen marriages, but they were chosen for them. Because Mr. Gibbs or Dr. Gibbs discusses how he didn't know anything about his wife and she didn't know anything about him, and how they were both filled with fear and concerns about what if we run about. I think there's something powerful in this statement I just realized. What if we run out of things to talk about? And I think that gets to kind of what you're saying, Mikey, about the inability or the unwillingness to be able to relate on a deeper level to each other versus what is just expected of them. There's no real. We talked about in personal relations how for a close personal relationship to succeed, there must be a revealing to one another about facts about each other. You must be able to reveal yourself to the other person so that they can better and more deeply understand who you are as an historical embodied creature. So I think there's something powerful in that observation.
Yeah, and as an extension of my observation, it seems that what is valued in Grover's Corners, is not the quality or depth or presence or meaning of interpersonal connection. Those things aren't valued or even understood. What's valued is process, structure, sameness, order, doing things the way that our parents did it and the way their parents did it, going to church at the correct time, your children marrying the correct people at the correct time. And as you said, many marriages are predetermined or arranged. And one of the things that's brought out in the play is how in Grover's Corners we don't have to lock our doors. Remember that? Because everyone knows each other and we have safety and peace. Safety, order, sameness, predictability are all valued. But they know nothing about deep connection.
So here's a question to the group. I mean, actually, before I ask that, Mark, do you have anything you want to contribute or add at this point?
I can add a little bit, especially to what Mikey says, in that that they don't really have this very personal connection. It's quite superficial, and I definitely feel that relates a lot to taking this point about, well, what if we run out about stuff to talk to, right? Because once you do that, then there isn't much left there to distract you from looking at the interpersonal connection and evaluating. So instead of doing that, just focus and talk on all of these other superficial things until and just get on with it.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that observation. Next question. What was my next question? Shouldn't have paused there for a second. My next question was going to be... Oh, yeah. Okay. So, in Grover's Corners, for the audience who might not know this, it's a well-known fact that the church organist is an alcoholic. He goes against the standard by virtue of his alcoholism. So here's a question for my esteemed partners, co-hosts. Do you think this inability to relate, this inability to invest in each other, led to the... Well, first of all, how do you think that impacts their... Okay, my question is twofold. How do you think that impacts, one, their ability to help the choir director overcome and confront his alcoholism, and overcome and confront his trauma? We never quite figure out what that trauma is. We're never told what that trauma is, but we're told that he's experienced a fair bunch of it. And number two, do you think that inability to connect on a deeper level kind of drove him to his... Because I have a theory that in that moment where he's confronted by Mr. Webb and the policeman, that's the night he takes his life. So do you think it is that... Do you think it's because of their inability to relate that, one, they can't really offer services to him to overcome his challenges, and two, that leads to that act of desperation of taking his own life? Who wants to break the silence here?
I'll volunteer a twofold answer. The first thing, that the having an alcoholic on the scene, in the as one of the characters, to me this makes it more of a typical small town. I mean, you can imagine any small town's going to have the town alcoholic. So I that's my first sense, is that Wilder is just trying to really paint the picture of a common small town with the town alcoholic. But that's to your question. I think it's perhaps overanalyzing and speculating, but yeah, one can speculate that if there was more capacity for emotional connections and deeper connections, then maybe people could have helped him. But that's a comment on a superficial small town where there's not a lot of capability for empathy. Yeah, it's my take.
Anyone else want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, no, I think you were really quite right on the spot when, you talked about like their inability to have like, a non-superficial connection, that's sort of stopping them from, sort of helping him forward and going on with it, because how else could you do that but through such a connection? And, further him bringing up like his issue, right? That's going to be even more like, how would you say, not appreciated, because it goes against, the status quo, in that, it's bringing up all of these other issues rather than just getting on with it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I also, I think I agree with both Mikey and Mark here. And I also think that there's an element of shame in there, and especially if you're trying to fit into a collective with other people, it's very easy to outcast those who are viewed as shameful by the status quo, so you don't put yourself there and become alienated by them.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. Okay, let me ask you this. Do you think they have any authentic relationships in Grover's Corners? Nicole, you can go first.
I'm not too familiar with the play to know exactly all the interactions, to know if there are authentic relationships, but from my viewing of the play, I watched I believe it's the 2003 version. It didn't seem like there's a lot of authentic relationships it more seems like everybody plays a role in growers' corners, and that is the extent of their character and their communication. But that also could be a facet of a theater play as well. Everybody plays a role. So I don't know if it's the medium that kind of also exacerbates that, and that might also be Thornton Wilder's intention with choosing the medium of a play to portray growers' corners instead of some other form.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that when you asked that question, Tagen, whether there were any authentic relationships, I couldn't think of an example in parts 1 and 2. Not that there aren't any, maybe there are. But then I was saying to myself, oh, maybe there were authentic relationships in Death, in the third part when they were all together in the room, dead, sitting and talking to each other. But then my answer is that I don't even think they were there, because what were they doing? They're in this room, they're all dead in this room, sitting rigidly in chairs as though they're watching someone on stage, but there's no stage. They're just sitting rigidly, looking straight forward, not even looking at each other, and they're talking about why would anyone want to go back to live that life in Grover's Corners. So even in Death, they weren't really relating to each other. And if my theory is correct that there were few, if any, authentic relationships, that creates a backdrop which allows Emily to stand in contrast, because Emily was struggling to create authentic relationships. She was seeking authenticity and real connection, and she couldn't find it anywhere. And so the gray background of the inauthenticity allows Emily and her color to stand out. Yeah.
Note how Emily is the only one. I mean, maybe it's not significant, maybe I'm overanalyzing, but just talking about letting her color shine through. Emily is the only one there that's in a colored piece of clothing. Not even the stage manager is really in a colored piece of clothing. Emily's in white, everyone else is in black.
But could that also be reduced to being a tool used by the playwriters, which is like to illuminate the main character and to bring focus towards that main character? It could be.
Yeah.
It might not be more than that.
Well, yeah, no, but if we really want to stretch it out and kind of, be like, hey, here it is. Well, there you go. If I look distracted, I'm actually looking for a quote right now as we speak, but I'll move this along and then I'll go back to it. I'll leave you with a question. So we've kind of talked about relationships. A little bit in terms of relating to each other, stuff like that. So let's look at George and Emily for a second. George is this kind of down, he's your classic farm boy type. In fact, that's all he wants to do. He wants to just be on the farm, and that's the epitome of life right there. And we see this in Act 2, where Emily has these dreams and aspirations of going out and going places, and she tries to encourage George to do that, but George is like, no, I don't want to leave you. I don't want to leave Grover's Corners because it's comfortable. Why do you think we as human beings settle for conformity, even though we do have our dreams and aspirations?
I can offer an answer to that question.
Go, Mikey.
And I would assert that this is one of the themes that Wilder is likely trying to get across, which is the dilemma that we face. See, I think that Wilder is painting a picture of commonality, a picture of every town, North America, of the predicament that all of us and each of us is in, which is that we want connection, we want love, we are connected to our families, we are connected to the places that we're born, and yet we also are trying to find our own meaning. And our dilemma is, how do we balance those? How do we get it all? How do we both honor our families? How do we find a partner? How do we find a marriage? How do we create our own family and find meaning in our own lives? And so the dilemma that Emily faced, and this comes out quite clearly, I believe, in the play, is she wanted marriage. She wanted to be a devoted wife. She wanted to marry George, and she wanted to support him in his dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And she wanted to connect with her mother and with her family and with the other townspeople. She had a lot of love for her town and for the people there. Yet she was struggling with how to find meaning in her life when the people around her were so unable to connect and had such low aspirations. I mean, low in the sense that they just wanted to do their daily routines until they died. So this was her dilemma.
They wanted to exist. They didn't want to live. And so, Mark or Nicole, do you have something to add to that before I ask a follow-up question and state an observation?
I would say that I do think it's interesting to perhaps investigate the question of why do people tend to conform when they have their own perhaps different life goals and ambitions. I would like to spend some time talking about that. We don't have to do it now. We can talk about it later, but that's just like my thought.
All right. Well, Mikey, you and I both know what the next show topic has to be, I guess. What about you, Mark?
Oh, I sort of feel like it's just a very easy thing to do in a way, in that, it's probably one of the most easiest things you can do, in that you just sort of, you have all these hopes, goals, and dreams perhaps, and there's sort of a sense in which like you can just repress yourself and sort of not like suffer all these like losses or the pains of trying to accomplish them or going through them or like failing at them even. So I think it comes down to in that it's a very easy thing to do, and I think in you sort of see it in this play, in that it has to do a lot with how you're raised as well and who you're around. So see the mother constantly like trying to get rid of these concerns and questions she has, and just get on with it, do what you're supposed to do.
So with that in mind, let's talk about Emily and George's love life for a second. Let's talk about the nature of that love. Because to truly love someone, I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, whether we agree with it or not, has been understood to be wanting or desiring the good of the other as other. So, and I think we see Emily do that for George, but George doesn't necessarily do that for Emily, because George isn't actually cognitively aware of how to do that for Emily. And I think that points to, because look at because I believe that Emily truly loved George. Whether he felt the same way is, debatable. But Emily truly loved George because she called George out on some things she had observed that all the other girls had been talking about, but it is only Emily that calls him out. Why? Because that's what true love looks like. We desire the good of the other as other, which means we want to see them better themselves. We want to see them be the best person they can be, whether that is with or without us. Mikey, you kind of you either agree with my assessment or you disagree. What's your thoughts on that? And then we'll go to Nicole and Mark for their assessment.
I disagree in part. I would say that Emily wanted to love George. She wanted to because she wanted to love somebody, and it's in her nature to be a devoted, loving person, wife. But there weren't very many options available. It's a small town. George was like the guy that was available. But I think there were several times in the script when Emily said something to the effect of, "I don't know who you are."
Name one.
I can't. I can't cite it right now. But I remember hearing a few. I remember a few times. We'll have to go back to the book.
How about her wedding discourse where she says, "I hate him and I don't know him at all."
Yes, they're good. And she got cold feet. She almost ran away. And then she switched. She turned around quickly when she realized that she would disappoint everybody. This was her struggle. So I think she wanted to love George, but I don't think she really felt that she knew him. If you don't know somebody, you can't really love that person, I would say. This was her dilemma. She was out of place in that town, but it was her town. She was caught. She was caught.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you, Mark? We'll jump to Mark instead of Nicole, then Mark for once.
Well, it sort of sounds to me like it's just something like easy to do, right? That, it's sort of expected of her to, just marry and settle down. And I think that's what she tries to do. And, part of herself, hates herself for doing so. But then she eventually just always keeps wandering back to it.
Right. Nicole, it's your turn. If you have anything to add.
I guess I don't know what I can say about Emily's nature or her personality and what she really intended for her love life. I do think that it seemed like she had good intentions, but I'm not sure if she married for the purpose of herself and her desires or the pressures of Growers Corners wanting her to get married and perhaps rushing into it before she really knew that that was something that she wanted.
And this is where another interesting question pops up that we don't really have time to answer at this point, but should you, or is it right to always strictly to marry for love? Because there are certainly situations where someone could argue they married out of necessity. And which is more correct? That's a debate for another day. And what is love anyway? That's another philosophical question altogether. Does anyone have any? How much time do we have, Mikey? I'm not keeping an eye on the clock here.
We have about 8 minutes, 9 minutes.
Oh, no pressure. Okay, so oh man, all right. So now the pressure's on. I know how I'm gonna end this. I'm gonna end with a really brief kind of roundtable discussion on Emily going back to the moment that she chooses her 12th birthday. So Emily has passed away from childbirth. I think there's some irony in there, dying to bring new life into the world, but that's another statement altogether. Emily, as I said earlier, does not feel comfortable in this new state of awareness that she's in. And she realizes, oh, but with this understanding, I can go back, can't I? I want to go back. I want to be able to relive a moment. Mother Gibbs says, Emily, don't. It's not worth it. The pain is too great. But Emily looks at the stage manager, and the stage manager kind of says, okay, we'll go. And the crowd says to her, pick an ordinary day, not a happy day. And Emily says, well, it can't be since I was married. And it can't be since I've had my baby boy. So I'll choose my 12th birthday. She goes back to her 12th birthday. And Mikey, you want to take this time to explain kind of that pivotal moment that occurs before I start to wrap this up with a quote from the text?
Yeah, thanks. If it's okay with you, I'd like to read a quote.
Please.
Quote right out of the text, because I think this is the telling moment in the script. So this is when Emily goes back to the world of the living. She goes into her house and she is talking to her mother. So Mrs. Webb, as part of the conversation, says, chew that bacon good and slow. It'll keep you warm on a cold day. Emily, unable to stand longer her mother's aloofness, slowly drops album on table and moves quickly to left of mother. Passionately, Emily says, oh, Mama, just look at me 1 minute as though you really saw me. Mrs. Webb turns front to stir oatmeal at stove, placid and smiling, not hearing. Emily turns down close behind her. Mama, 14 years have gone by. I'm dead. You're a grandmother, Mama. More and more desperate, Emily says, I married George Gibbs, Mama. Wally's dead too. Mama, his appendix burst on a camping trip to Crawford Notch. We felt just terrible about it. Don't you remember? But just for a moment, now we're all together, Mama. Now we're all together. Just for a moment, let's be happy. Mama, just for a moment, let's look at one another. Mrs. Webb takes one step to the left to put the dish on the table. Now, it's not written in the book, but the way it was directed in the play we watched on the video, there's about 10 seconds of silence as Mrs. Webb looks at Emily, sort of like, what are you talking about, right? And Mrs. Webb says, in response to Emily saying, for a moment, let's be happy, Mrs. Webb says, that in the yellow paper is something I found in the attic among your grandmother's things. You're old enough to wear it now, and I thought you'd like it. And then it goes on, and we see that Mrs. Webb is completely unable to understand or comprehend or respond to Emily's attempt at connection.
Thanks, Mikey. I want to do a really quick roundtable from everybody, and then I want to close with a quote, and we'll close the show out. Mark, go. What do you have to do? What's your thoughts on our town as a whole? How about that as the final question?
As a whole, well, yeah, I definitely think it has a lot of existential themes to it. Yeah. A thought I had about it was that later, I think it sort of related a lot to like Nietzsche's, well, I guess, like thought experiment of eternal reoccurrence, where he said, you should live, if you want to affirm life, as much as you possibly can, you should live it as though that you would be happy with living it again and again forever. And I think maybe it's something similar that they're getting at, where they're sitting, at the theater, and they, all the other people, they just want to see, they don't really want to watch the play. Yeah. So I think so.
Okay, Nicole.
My main takeaway from our town, and firstly, I want to say that I did not have any background knowing anything about our town before Tagen introduced me to the place. So thank you very much, Tagen, for introducing me. My main takeaway, as Mark said, is the existential themes that are portrayed by our town, and specifically themes of life, death, meaning, conformity, and those are the main themes that stick out to me. And I do think that it is important to examine these themes, especially like conformity. I think that is something that is important to discuss in our time right now, and always, because we do have a tendency to conform, even, and Growers Corners isn't the only example of where this happens. It happens all around us, and is conformity really something negative, or does it have some sort of protective factor for our well-being? And that's some questions that I come with after talking about our town, because I do see the agony that Emily goes through in the third act when she dies and then goes back in a state of consciousness and tries to communicate with people on a true level. Like, is that really something that we should be aiming for? And are we putting ourselves in a compromising position by trying to be authentic and connect on a real level with people and not have that reciprocated?
Okay, I really quickly, sorry Mikey not to get to you, but I really quickly want to read this quote because I think it summarizes kind of the state of Grover's Corners. This happens after Emily has passed away. Come back, says to Mother Gibbs, "I should have listened to you, not gone back." The choir director says, "Yes, now you know. Now you know. That's what it is to be alive, to move about in a cloud of ignorance, to go up and down, tampering on the feelings of those about you, to spend and waste time as though you had 1,000,000 years, to always at the mercy of one's self-centered passion or another. Now you know. That's the happy existence you wanted to go back to. Ignorance and bliss." Mrs. Gibbs says, "Simon Stinson, that ain't the whole truth and you know it. Emily, look to the star." I forget its name. So as we close out the show, I am Tagen Marshall with my esteemed co-host Michael Robert Caditz, Nicole Kirigin, and Mark Giles. Keep looking to the stars and we'll talk to you next week. Bye everyone.